A romp through Berkeley's immaterialism. George Berkeley was born in Ireland on the 12th of March 1658. His education began at Kilkenny College, and from there he went to Trinity College in Dublin. And there he studied languages, mathematics and philosophy. He was ordained as a bishop in the Anglican Church in 1710. Philosophically, Berkeley belonged to the school of the empiricists, along with others such as John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and David Hume. Empiricism's basic tenet is that all knowledge is derived from sensory data. That is, all of our beliefs ultimately come from experience, rather than through abstract rationalization or the power of the intellect. But Berkeley moves in a new and exciting direction by claiming that there is no such thing as matter, hence the doctrine's name, immaterialism. Let's talk for a moment about Berkeley's context. René Descartes famously used methodological doubt to conclude that the only thing we can have absolute certitude of is the self as a thinking being. John Locke used his image theory of perception to say that man was basically a blank tablet waiting to be formed by a world of objects. For Locke, our ideas are just how we subjectively react to objects. Our ideas are images or representations of external bodies. He also distinguished between primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities really do belong to bodies outside of my perception, things like solidity, extension, motion, etc. But secondary qualities like color or taste or sound are subjectively caused in us. Secondary qualities are not really there apart from consciousness. So the point we want to make here is that although both Descartes and Locke were skeptics in their own right, both of them at least believed in the existence of material objects as existing outside of consciousness. Quite radically then, Berkeley comes along and rejects the material world altogether. He thought that Locke's belief in substances existing independently of the mind was a myth. He agreed that we only know secondary qualities as objects of consciousness, but he went further to say the same thing about primaries. After all, we never experience secondaries without primaries, greenness apart from apples, or greenness apart from trees, or whatever object we're talking about. All qualities are given to us in the same one experience, and all these experiences are just ideas in the mind. Quote, "If it be certain that those original qualities are inseparably united from the other sensible qualities, and not even in thought capable of being abstracted from them, it plainly follows that they exist only in the mind." End quote. Further, if all we can claim to know are our ideas, how can we ever know which ideas accurately represent things in themselves? How can we ever compare the representation with the real thing if we only ever have access to the copy? Well, we can't, thought Berkeley. Every act of assertion makes sense only in light of our experience, and experiences are always ideas. So what he's saying is actually quite convincing. Because if you try to imagine a figure or motion or color, if you try to imagine something like that existing without a perceiving mind, it really is quite impossible. He also argues that if material bodies existed without perceiving minds, that would mean that God would have created things which were entirely useless. Berkeley also rejected the idea of abstraction. The calling to memory of previous experiences is precisely that. It's remembering an encounter with a particular. Every idea is a copy of some particular sense impression. Any hand or house or dog imagined must have a particular color or shape. Now, of course, he understood that we need to talk about things in a more general way, and that we also need to categorize items in the world under the umbrella of universals like houseness or dogness or whatever. But he argued that each separate idea corresponded to a particular instance from where that idea stems. Each idea gets associated with various others, allowing us to form what we feel to be more complex, generalized ideas. So 100 perceived tables coalesce in my mind to help me come up with the idea of a table that is not bound to just one instance. But it isn't abstraction. He says, quote, "As it is impossible for me to see and or feel anything without an actual sensation of that thing, so it is impossible for me to conceive in my thoughts any sensible thing or object distinct from the sensation or perception of it." End quote. All this leads Berkeley to declare his famous catchphrase, esse est percipi. Loosely translated, this means that the only way that things exist is in perception. Now this does sound a little startling, and indeed many of his contemporaries thought that he'd gone mad. An understandable accusation, because in a sense, Berkeley is saying that life is an illusion. For example, if the office table that I'm looking at only has being insofar that it is being looked at, then when I leave the room, it stops existing. In a sense, this is what he is arguing, but it's far too easy and academically irresponsible to just dismiss Berkeley without first fully understanding his nuances. Berkeley fully acknowledges that we can all imagine parks, trees, birds, and swings that remain unperceived by any observer. His point is that in that act, you are again precisely imagining all those things, just this time without a perceiver, and the matter of all these is still in your mind. Again, it's not that he is denying reality, rather he is challenging his audience to ask themselves, what does it mean to say that the world is real? Going back to the office table example, everything I can possibly say about or think about the table is an idea of my experience. There can be nothing about that table that falls outside of my experiencing it in various combinations of ideas. Objects don't exist without ideas of them, and the existence of an idea consists in it being perceived. Now, if you were to challenge him and say, well, I just bumped into that table, and it was hard, it was sharp, it was wooden, it hurt my shin, Berkeley would tell you, fine, but all those sensations you just described, the hardness, the extension, the woodenness, even the pain, are similarly ideas. Again, he is not saying that there isn't a real world. Quote, "I do not argue against the existence of any one thing that we can apprehend, either by sense or reflection. That the things I see with my eyes and touch with my hands do exist, really exist, I make not the least question." End quote. What he is saying is that it isn't a material world. Why? Because there are no independently existing things outside of an experience. And it's just silly to ask, can we know things through experience that are outside of experience? Of course we can't, he'd say. For Berkeley, then, there is no unthinking substance or substratum of our perceptions or ideas. The only substances that exist are what he calls perceiving spirits. A reasonable thought to have at this juncture is, well, do objects stop existing when I stop perceiving them? Well, not necessarily. For one thing, someone else might be perceiving that object even when I'm not. So it's never the case that I'm actually conferring reality onto things. But what if no one at all is looking at or thinking about some object? Then does it cease to be? Well, if that were possible, then Berkeley would surely have to concede the point. However, we remind ourselves here as well that he was a churchman who, in much of his work, was essentially arguing for the existence of God. God is the absolute mind. And Berkeley's task, again, was to inspire his readers with a pious sense of the presence of God. But it is God's ceaseless and eternal perception that holds everything in being. God regulates and sustains the whole system of beings. So obviously, when my mind or other minds are not perceiving the table, God's mind is. Moreover, God's mind is the mind that causes the existence of all my ideas. Note, Our own ideas are not usually dependent on our wills. Ideas of things impinge upon us in ways that are often not of our own choosing. Quote, "There are spiritual substances, minds or human souls, which will or excite ideas in themselves at pleasure, but these are faint, weak, and unsteady in respect of others they receive by sense, which being impressed upon them according to certain rules or laws of nature, speak themselves the effects of a mind more powerful and wise than human spirits." End quote. In fact, the most real things are the ideas imprinted upon us by the author of nature, and this spirit, this God, is simple and undivided, himself perceiving by divine understanding and operating by divine will. A reasonable objection to the idea of the absolute mind would be to ask, well, isn't the very idea that I have of God just another one of my subjective ideas? It is hard to see how he proves otherwise, but he tries to, by making the distinction between idea and spirit. The former is passive and exists insofar as it is perceived by another, but a soul or spirit is an active being whose existence consists not in being perceived, but in perceiving ideas and thinking. What Berkeley seems to be saying then is that that which I am conscious of and my own perceiving self is in fact God's idea. In other words, if we interpret Berkeley thus, what we have is not pure idealism or subjectivism, but a self that really does come into contact with the non-self, and that non-self is the spirit or mind of God.